Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson from Unit 2 about constitutional history is Lesson 12 about judicial review. In this lesson, you'll learn about the judicial branch. You'll learn about judicial weakness, about the concept of judicial review, the important Supreme Court case of Marbury versus Madison, and about judicial strength. In previous lessons, we learned about the concept of separation of powers, that the national government's powers are divided among three branches: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Each of those branches of government is established in the first few articles, or a way to think of it is chapters in the Constitution. Article 1 of the Constitution establishes that there will be a United States Congress consisting of a Senate and House of Representatives. Article 2 of the United States Constitution establishes that there will be a president to execute the laws and carry them out. And Article 3 of the United States Constitution establishes that there will be a United States Supreme Court to perform the judicial function for the country, and that there will be additional inferior courts as Congress decides to create from time to time. These then are the three branches of the government that we talked about during our discussion prior of separation of powers. Then after discussing separation of powers, we talked about the concept of checks and balances in a previous lesson. This is the idea that the three branches of government have their power overlap, so they can check and balance each other. In other words, keep each other under control. We gave some examples of that. The legislative branch controlling the budget of the executive and the judicial branch, or the executive being able to veto laws passed by the legislature. But what power does the judicial branch have to check the other branches of government? In a way, that's a trick question, because the right answer, at least as found in the Constitution, is that the judicial branch has no power to check the other branches. There are no powers assigned to the judicial branch in the Constitution that it can specifically use to try to stop the other branches from doing things. Because the judicial branch is not assigned any specific powers in the Constitution that it can use to check the actions of the other branches. At the time that the Constitution was written and then sent out to the states to be ratified, and state conventions were held to debate whether or not to ratify it, there was a general feeling among some people, for example Alexander Hamilton, that the judicial branch would be obviously the weakest of all the branches, and therefore a branch that you didn't really need to worry about. Remember, there was a fear at the time that the national government might be too strong, that it might abuse its power and oppress and take advantage of the people. But Hamilton argued that even if you do have fears like that, and they might be reasonably put upon the Congress or the presidency, he said there was no reason to fear the judicial branch because it was so weak. And specifically, he pointed out, here in this quote, that the judicial branch does not have either a sword or a purse. Now, what he meant by that was they do not have an army or a police force to force others to accept their decisions, nor do they have money of their own to go buy an army or a police force to force people to accept their decisions. He said for that reason, they have neither force nor will, but only judgment, and that they would have to depend on the executive to actually enforce their decisions. So in this way, they were really weak. All they could do was render their decisions and say, well, this side should win, this side should lose, and the case is before them. But whether anybody ever actually listened to them or obeyed them would be an entirely different question that they would have to depend on the other branches to help them with. Now, despite this apparent weakness, the judicial branch does, in fact, exercise power over the other branches through a process called judicial review. Judicial review is when the judiciary reviews, or in other words, looks over a law or an action of some other party in government, such as the president doing something, and decides whether or not that thing is constitutional. In this way, they can check the other branches and stop them from doing things that the judges think are inappropriate. They simply say, that's unconstitutional, you can't do that. But, as I mentioned a moment before, they were given no power to check the other branches in the Constitution. So this idea of judicial review is not actually found in the Constitution anywhere. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the judicial branch, including the United States Supreme Court, can declare things to be unconstitutional. It's not found there anywhere. So where did it come from? Where did they get this idea? Well, some people thought it was kind of implicit in the notion of having a judiciary that they should be able to do this. But them actually exercising that potential power first came about as a result of the election of 1800. This was the third election held in the country to decide a president. George Washington had won the first two elections unanimously. The entire country wanted him as president. Things were easy. But then when he retired from office, did not seek re-election in the election of 1896. Sorry. He had been president in the 1788 election, 1792 election, and then he retired in 1796. He handpicked a successor in 1796, John Adams. John Adams then ran for president, was successfully elected, kind of on the coattails of George Washington. Everyone loved George Washington. George Washington said, vote for John Adams, so everybody voted for John Adams. He was elected president. But some people thought he did a bad job as president. Matter of fact, they were specifically concerned about some of the things that he and his supporters did in the presidency. And they formed an opposition. And that opposition was led by Thomas Jefferson. And so in the election of 1800, you had a heavily contested election between Jefferson and John Adams. And in the end, Thomas Jefferson won, defeated the sitting president, John Adams. Now, this is a remarkable thing in and of itself, because you had John Adams, who was a member of the ruling party, so to speak. He was a Federalist. The Federalists were among the people who had supported the Constitution. George Washington considered himself a Federalist. They had swept to power and gotten all the offices and positions in government, and they had held all those positions basically for 12 years. And then they lost an election. And they didn't just lose the presidency, they lost the majority in both houses of Congress to the upstart challengers led by Thomas Jefferson, who called themselves Republicans. And the amazing thing about this is that when they were defeated, John Adams and the other Federalists stepped aside and let the Republicans take over peacefully. This is one of the first times in human history that this happened, that one faction, one party, one group that entirely controlled a government, upon losing an election, simply stepped aside and let the other party take over. But even though they were willing to step aside and let the other party take over, they did everything they could to keep as much power as possible. And one of the ways that they tried to do that was by, before John Adams left office, the United States Congress, which was still controlled by Federalists, created a bunch of new inferior courts, inferior judges. Remember, that was one of those things that I mentioned just a few moments ago when we talked about Article 3 creating the judiciary. Article 3 said there'll be a Supreme Court and other inferior courts as Congress will decide. So what Congress did was created a whole bunch of new judgeships right at the last minute. The election was held in 1800, but the new people didn't take office till 1801. So right before the old people had to leave power, they passed a law that created a bunch of new judgeships. These were called the midnight judges because those positions were created at the last minute. And then John Adams appointed a bunch of his Federalists to fill those positions. But this is all being done at the last minute. And the person in John Adams' government who was assigned to actually deliver these appointments to these new judgeships to people was a man named John Marshall. He was the Secretary of State under John Adams. And it was his responsibility to make sure that the people who had been appointed to these judgeships got their commissions. Well, he failed to do it. The reason he failed to do it was because he was among the people that was appointed to a new judgeship, and he was kind of busy with that. He had been appointed to be the new Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. So there was really a stack of appointments that were placed on his desk that he was supposed to deliver, and he never got around to doing it in the short time that they were there before the Federalists left office, because he was off assuming his job as Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Well, one of those people who had been appointed to a judgeship was a man named William Marbury. And William Marbury, having never received his appointment, but wanting it, when the new administration took office, went looking for his appointment. And he requested it from James Madison. Okay, remember, John Adams had been president. John Marshall had been his Secretary of State. As Secretary of State, John Marshall was supposed to be delivering these commissions to all these new judges that had been created by the Federalist Congress at the last minute. That's why they were called midnight judges. But Marshall had failed to deliver those appointments. That's why Marbury didn't get his. Then Thomas Jefferson, the new president, took office, and he appointed James Madison, the father of the Constitution, remember him, to be his Secretary of State, the same position that John Marshall had had previously. So now James Madison's the Secretary of State. And he goes into his office, so to speak, and there's this stack of appointments sitting on his desk that were supposed to have been delivered by the previous Secretary of State, but he'd failed to do so. And James Madison looks at this stack of appointments, which are for a bunch of Federalists, but he's not a Federalist, he's a Republican, and he throws them in the trash. That's why Marbury didn't get his appointment. So Marbury goes to court. He sues James Madison to try to get his appointment delivered to him so he can become a judge. Well, he brought that lawsuit under a provision of a previous law passed by Congress called the Judiciary Act of 1789, which said that if a government official isn't doing their job, a person potentially can bring a lawsuit to get something called a writ of mandamus. That'd be an order telling that person in government to go do their job. So Marbury wanted a writ of mandamus ordering James Madison to give him his appointment so he could become a judge. Well, he brought this lawsuit, and he brought it directly in the United States Supreme Court. That's what the Judiciary Act of 1789 said he could do. So now the person presiding over his case, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, is the very guy that had failed to deliver his appointment before. But the Supreme Court is placed in a difficult situation here. The reason is because the Federalists have been swept out of power. They lost the presidency. They lost control of Congress. The country is overwhelmingly turned toward the Republicans. They don't really like the Federalists anymore. But here's Chief Justice John Marshall, a Federalist. And the court is full of Federalists who had been appointed by George Washington and John Adams. And they realize that if they rule in Marbury's favor and say, hey, yeah, Marbury should get his appointment, James Madison may still just continue to ignore them. If they complain to the president, Thomas Jefferson, he may continue to ignore them. And if they are simply ignored when they make a decision, they will look extremely weak. Matter of fact, he was afraid he might even be impeached and kicked out of office by Congress if he tried to do this. But if he says to Marbury, you don't get your appointment, then all his fellow Federalists will be mad at him. He's a Federalist chief judge. He's supposed to be looking out for the other Federalists, including William Marbury. So it seems like any way he rules, he's going to make somebody mad. So he found a brilliant way out of this problem. And that was, he said that this power, this authority that had been given to the Supreme Court to issue writs of mandamus is a violation of the Constitution. Now, I won't go into the arguments of why he said it was a violation. It's a little bit complicated. But just to realize that for the first time, the Supreme Court declared an act of Congress. That's what had told Marbury he could do this thing. They declared an act of Congress to be unconstitutional. And then they went farther in their decision in the case of Marbury versus Madison. They said, well, an act of the legislature, a law passed by the legislature that is unconstitutional, is void. In other words, it doesn't exist anymore. So they had declared an act of Congress to be illegitimate. Wiped it out. Now, the practical result for this case was that John Marshall said to Marbury, well, you should get your appointment, but we can't give it to you because the law that says that we could is unconstitutional. the practical result was Marbury lost, which then made Thomas Jefferson and James Madison happy. They had won. They didn't have to give the appointment to Marbury. But think about what this action really did. By the Supreme Court declaring a law unconstitutional, they had essentially said, we, the judges, get to decide what the law is or isn't. We get to decide what is legitimate under the Constitution and what is not legitimate under the Constitution. And in them doing that, they had seized what is arguably the biggest power under the Constitution. Think about it. Whoever decides the rules of a game really has the most power in that game. And that's what the Supreme Court had claimed here in this case. They get to decide who's breaking the rules or not. Congress does something they don't like, they say, oh, that's unconstitutional, you can't do that. President does something they don't like, they say, oh, that's unconstitutional, you can't do that. So they simply did it in this case of Marbury versus Madison. And then they held their breath to wait to see what happened. And they got away with it. Neither of the other branches came back and punished them for it. They got away with it. And they have been doing this action of declaring things unconstitutional ever since. And that is what we know as judicial review. Let's review what we learned in this case, in this lesson. First question. What article in the Constitution creates the judiciary? Is it Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, or Article 4? It's Article 3. Article 1 creates the United States Congress. Article 2 creates the presidency. Article 3 creates the judiciary, including the Supreme Court. We'll talk about Article 4 in another lesson. Why was the judiciary thought weak to begin with? Was it because there were only a small number of judges? That they only had short terms in office? That the Constitution itself was weak? Or that they had no money or no army? The right answer is that they had no money or no army, no way to enforce their decisions. Next question. Why is Marbury versus Madison considered so important? Is it because it establishes the concept of judicial review? Because in it they impeached the president? Because it harmed the power of the court? Or because in that case they decided an election? The correct answer is that it established the power of judicial review, which isn't listed in the Constitution, but they did it anyway. So what is judicial review? Is it that judges get removed from office? Is it that you have to have Senate approval for judges? Is it that laws can be ruled unconstitutional by the court? Or is it their way of enforcing their decisions? Judicial review is because of judicial review, their ability to declare the acts of other members of government unconstitutional. Okay, that does it for Lesson 12 about judicial review. Our next lesson will be also from Unit 2, Lesson 13 about enumerated power.